I was a first-year student in 1946. I got my honours in 51, early 51, and I finished my master's in 1953, it must have been. For my master's degree, I did research on an assistantship. I was paid £25 a month. Out of that, I bought a typewriter and I bought an engagement ring. I'm still astonished that I could do things like that in so little. But in any case, it was a really good experience because it was a grant from what is now the HSRC to Professor Harten. And it was just a wonderful opportunity. It was on manual dexterity tests. Today it would have counted as an industrial psychology project, but at that time industrial psychology wasn't an independent field yet. I worked at what is now the HSRC for 5 months after I left the university, working on the new South African group test, intelligence test. I wrote many of the items that went into the final test. I left there for a new job at the South African Railways, and that lasted 5 months. I was working for Professor Skavron. He used to be professor at Pretoria University. And there's a long story to that too, how he left and how he didn't get his job back when he left and when he came back. But I worked there for 5 months, which was just long enough to teach me how not to do personnel selection. And I got an opportunity to go to Diepkloof Reformatory, which was here outside Johannesburg, a reformatory for black boys, and spent a year there. While I was there, I finished writing up my thesis. And then on the 25th of September, 1953, I received a letter from Professor Harting to say that I was going to get my master's degree with distinction and that I should expect a letter from the registrar of the university offering me a lectureship, and I should consider seriously to accept it. And to crown it all, 5 o'clock that afternoon, my eldest son was born. 3 things on one day. That's unforgettable. So the next year I went back to Potchefstroom. I was there for 3 years when I went to America for a PhD. For 2.5 years I was there, Purdue University. And I did an internship in Indianapolis at child guidance clinic there and at an outpatient psychiatric hospital. August of 59, I was back in Potchefstroom. Immediately started planning, well, I had started this already in America, but planning a master's degree in clinical psychology. Eventually we established 2 master's degrees, one in clinical and one in child clinical psychology. And they were the first clinical programs, specifically clinical programs in the country. Dawie Gous and the Dr. Lejeune, who was teaching here at Wits, she later on went back to England, came and talked to me about what we had done, and the next year Wits started one too. I have to add that Stellenbosch had an MA in what they called abnormal psychology before that, and that was an early start in the clinical direction, but they didn't really have a clinical program. So that was a marvelous opportunity to really build something, develop something. I saw 3 students through the MA in clinical. Because it was a full-time degree, it was hard for people who were working elsewhere. And in fact, all 3 of them finished it long after they had done the coursework, but I mainly did the teaching, and it was a heavy load. People nowadays can't think how hard we taught, how hard we worked at simple, straightforward teaching. By the time I left Potchefstroom, I had 23 hours of lecturing per week, which I thought was crazy, and I couldn't see why we should do it. The problem was that universities in those days were terribly poor. And they had small departments. Just in front of our building was geology, for instance, which had just a few students. And then they had subjects like Hebrew and Latin and things for theology students, which very few students took, but they needed staff for those. So we were teaching heavy loads so that there would be money available for them. I don't know how many master students I had, part-time people working on theses, but in any case, I got fed up with it. I moaned about it, and I moaned at high levels about it. There was a possibility of a job at the NIPR, which Dawie Gous offered me. It was to be liaison with the military system, the military research. And in the end, the reason why I didn't accept it, was simply because I was supposed to do confidential work. Dawie told me I couldn't talk about any of my work with anyone. I said, no, that's not for me. And nothing would get published. It was hush-hush, everything. That's of course silly, because some of it is good research that could just as well be published for the rest of the world. But I then said, no, I can't do that kind of work, and so I didn't come. But then shortly afterwards, the University of Port Elizabeth was established, and I was appointed there, and I started at with Appel van Aarde, who's still around. We started the department. There were 18 professors to begin the university, and I don't know how many senior lecturers, hardly any lecturers. We started off with Psychology 1 and Honours, and then added Psychology 2 the next year, Psychology 3 the year after that. That was a fantastic experience. I've never been in so many meetings per year as I was there, because it was just committee work all the way through. How do we do this? How do we do that? It was the first new university to be established in lots of time, many years. The staff that came there, among the professors, there was one institution of higher learning that was not represented in South Africa. So that it was an incredible mix of people. And everyone was handpicked. That was the cream of academics in South Africa. Well, of what was available in South Africa. Dawie Gous, for instance, said he couldn't come. He was supposed to be the professor of industrial psychology, and he said he couldn't come because he had started things here that he just couldn't drop at that stage. It was unbelievably stimulating. In any case, I was still teaching clinical psychology, but then I discovered McClelland, David McClelland, and his achievement motivation particularly. I wrote into the syllabus a course on motivation psychology for the second year students. And Bok Maree was going to come to us as a lecturer the next year, and I had to tell Bok what more or less he had to teach. So I started reading about motivation a bit, and it just grabbed me. I taught that course, and then eventually taught motivation at the honours level. And for years I was involved in motivation, mainly achievement motivation. I eventually developed a program on achievement orientation for Sanlam, which we ran quite a few times. But that was a phase of achievement motivation. Along the way, power motivation came into it, and Victor Nell and I had a paper published on his master's thesis, one that was internationally published. on which McClelland gave us very favorable comments. Then I became interested in personal autonomy. And with John Tilley, who's still practicing here in Johannesburg, and Peter Hartz, who's been in Vancouver for donkey's years already, they were my research assistants. We put together a questionnaire. And so it went on and on. Questionnaires were my thing. Then, really through the achievement motivation, because the work that of McClelland and David Winter did really interesting work in India, where they influenced small business through teaching achievement orientation. And it was a takeoff on their program that we developed for Sanlam, but certainly a local thing, because they never, in fact, I was in their offices in Boston. They showed me the handout that's given to the people, but it was empty. There were no lectures or anything in it. So I couldn't really find out what they were doing. I had to do it from the description in a book and a journal article. Through those kinds of things, I became interested in organizational kind of things, organizational psychology, although it wasn't really called organizational psychology at that time. It was still just industrial psychology. And then I found out that there was going to be a workshop, a 3-day workshop in Somerset West, taught by 2 Dutchmen from the NPI. It used to be the Nederlands Pedagogisch Instituut, but they abbreviated it to NPI. And I sort of got the rector to agree that this was something in motivational psychology and stuff that I was teaching, so he sent me there. And that really turned me on to organizational psychology, and Rensis Lickert was prominent. I bought the book afterwards, read it later on, bought his second book and read it, and I really strongly became interested in organizational, but I couldn't teach it because there was the Department of Industrial Psychology next door with Ampie Miller and Louis Kampfer, and later on Roo van der Merwe. But in any case, then I had a sabbatical and went to UCLA for a month-long course on organization development, and half of the time we spent in sensitivity training. At the end of the first week, I said to a good friend there were 17 of us, I said to a friend there, I now feel on top of the world. It was marvelous. You couldn't believe that you could feel so good. At the end of the second week, I said to him, I feel as if I'm walking on jelly now. By the third week, I was just almost in depression. And then the last week they spent putting us together. It was one of the most important experiences of my life. There was Robert Tannenbaum, Bob Tannenbaum was in charge of the program. And he actually was an accountant by training, but he was one of the best people, really a top person in the field of OD and sensitivity training, personal development kind of stuff. And we had lecturers from TRW and such companies came in to talk to us about organization development. Okay, I came back with all of this stuff. I made a tour of universities through Canada and America, USA, including Harvard University, where I met McClelland. I couldn't get an appointment with him. He said he was too busy. He couldn't make appointments ahead of time. I just arrived in his office, and I said to the secretary, could I see him? No, he's flying off this afternoon somewhere. I said, but his name is mentioned in every lecture of mine. I can't go away if I don't meet this man. She said, well, she'll go in and see. And she said, then I should come. there's his cabinet, filing cabinet. He said I should look what's in there, and if there's any, it's all of his reprints. I can take whatever I want, and he will see me during the lunch hour. So we had 3/4 of an hour together, which was marvelous. I've had so many marvelous things happen to me. In any case, I was there and at several other universities in connection with motivation and organizational stuff and so on. Came back. There was Louis Camphor with precisely the same interests as mine. He didn't go to UCLA or NTL for his development. He went to, what's the place in England for his training. And we worked together a lot. Eventually, I did teach 2 courses in social psychology and organization development to honor students in industrial. But I was kind of out of it. I couldn't teach what I wanted to teach. The other part of that story is that by then I wanted to emigrate. I was just desperate to get out of the country. Political stuff. I was doing sensitivity training with students left, right, and center. And to the nationalists, that was taboo. As a result, I had a dossier with the security police, and I knew about it because one of the informers tried to play it both ways and tried to threaten me with this bit of knowledge that he had. And certainly what he told me about what the police were asking about me was inside personal information that was quite shocking. But that was sort of one reason that I wanted to just get away. Another reason was that when I was putting together the questions for the personal autonomy questionnaire, I just collected items all over, published stuff, existing stuff that could be related to it, and we started off with about 200 plus items from which we eventually selected about 40. But we then, it had, the 2 assistants administered the questionnaires in Afrikaans and in English. We did item analyses. And I one evening sat looking at the items that finally sort of survived. And there was one item, and I still remember where it originated, but it said that communism couldn't be all wrong or something to that effect. Kind of open-mindedness item. I thought, oh heck, if the security police saw this one, I'd be in real trouble. So I'd better replace it with another one. And it really shocked me. I said to myself, what the hell are you trying to do here? For political reasons, change an item that had been selected completely according to the rules of psychometry. Experiences like that, really, it's a tiny thing. It's minute. But when you put it in context, you just say, well, if this is where I have to live, I want to get out. So I started applying to go overseas, first to Canada, well, Canada, USA, a bit Australia. At one point there, I got a letter from one of the Canadian universities where the guy said it's the 2nd time now that they've decided they could really use me, but the rule is that you have to come for a colloquium, and they don't have the money to get me all the way. I said, I'll come at my own expense, so I went. But then I simply went to another university for a colloquium, or 2 others for a colloquium, and at one they actually appointed me, and then afterwards decided no, but they couldn't. They had a change in staff that left, and I wouldn't then fit into the new pattern. That I heard long afterwards. But I did get a temporary appointment replacing somebody at the University of Regina in the Faculty of Administration, and that's where I really taught personnel management and or human resource management and organizational psychology for a year. I was working with an Indian guy who was the senior there, and he was a most useful friend. He would give me, well, look at this book, look at this case study, and so on. And it was a year in which I actually worked myself into organizational psychology, published even in that field while I was there. I could have had an appointment as an associate professor at University of Regina, but I said I can't come down this far in the world because an associate professorship didn't have tenure. Full professor, you immediately have tenure. And I couldn't take a chance on that. I said I have a family to look after, and I couldn't take chances. And the dean said, well, we'll think about it, and then he went on sabbatical and nothing happened, so I came back. But then I got a job in Australia. Just after I came back here from Canada, I had a heart attack in 1976. And the Australians in the end said they didn't want a person who suffers from heart disease, and I didn't get in there. Shortly after that, I got a second appointment in Australia, a beautiful job at a medical school. I just had to write and say, your government doesn't want me to get there. So that was the end of my attempts. It was the best thing that could have happened to me that I didn't get out, because subsequently I learned more about Australian psychology, and at that time it certainly was boring. It was hopelessly experimental. But what happened then, okay, I then went into private practice for 2 years in Port Elizabeth because I had resigned from UPE. I also wanted to get out of there. I didn't want to stay there anymore. I was in private practice for 2 years. It was also really a worthwhile period in my life. But I then got a job here at Wits Business School to teach organizational behavior. That was another really marvelous stretch of my career, because it was all interdisciplinary. There were all kinds of people there teaching various subjects, really top people, brilliant people. But there were constantly visitors, overseas visitors, local visitors. You could go to the tea room any morning and there would be some European or some American or whatever. So that was an incredible period. But eventually I felt that I wasn't teaching my subject anymore. Some of it was more or less almost first year kind of stuff, but since it was mature students, it was something different. It was a different level. But when I got a job offer at UCT to start industrial psychology there, I was willing to accept. It cost me 18% in my salary, but it was worth it. Rita and I went down. She became senior lecturer there, and I was professor. Later on, Charles Cogill, who had been here with us at Wits, who then went to Natal University, also came down to Cape Town again, and we were then 3 teaching industrial there. That went on for 10 years. I taught organizational psychology and occupational health psychology because that's what I was interested in by then. The way I got into that was that when I had to do my inaugural address here at Wits, I did it on executive distress, executive eustress, and what makes the difference. In the process of writing about it, I came across a reference to Antonovsky, who was an Israeli medical sociologist. And he really grabbed me. He published a second book, which I immediately ordered, and we had an opportunity to go and teach at Ben Gurion University over the Christmas and January period. And then I met Antonovsky too, who was at that same university. We were teaching not in a different faculty. He was in the medical school. I met him in total 4 times, but we became correspondents, and I would send him stuff that I wrote and he would comment on it. He was an incredible person to know. But his emphasis was on what he called salutogenesis, the origins of health. Eventually I wrote an article to summarize this change of direction in thinking, that it is on health that we should place the emphasis and not pathology. Well, not denying pathology, but there's life elsewhere too, much more life in fact. I first wrote an article in which I summarized the existing stuff at that time. Then I wrote another article subsequently in which I said that what he was talking about is not just health, physical health, but it's strength all over wherever people function. And I then, with the help of a professor of Latin at UCT, developed the name of fortogenesis, the origins of strength. Fortis is strength. And that was for most of what was left of my life became where I'm functioning, that I'm interested in fortogenesis, what helps people to be strong at work, in their physical health, in their families, in bringing up children, community things, strength all over the place.